Electric vehicles. We start to see them on the roads every day. The sales of EVs have been steadily rising in many states in recent years. One interpretation of this development is that people have finally realized the need to save the planet and that the electric cars are getting better by the day. And there is some truth to that. But there is also another side to the story, one of subsidization of EVs and bullying of combustion engine cars. In this video, you will learn about EV subsidies and normal car disadvantaging in selected countries. What happens if you take the subsidies away? And what is the future of the subsidies? Norway is the poster child of EV adoption. It is also the best example of uneven competition in automobile sales. So I will go through the Norwegian example before turning to other nations. The sales of EVs in Norway skyrocketed and represent more than 80% of total new car sales, by far the highest share in the world. Meanwhile, in many other places, you see EV sales in low single-digit percentages. Let's look at some factors influencing the decision whether to buy an electric car versus gasoline or diesel car. It's the purchase price of the vehicle, the cost of usage, and the convenience. Perhaps the major obstacle to higher electric car sales is their comparably higher price. According to Financial Times, EVs cost 30 to 40% more than equivalent combustion engine car. The following is a hypothetical example. Let's say you are facing a choice of whether to buy a $40,000 gasoline car or equivalent EV which costs $55,000. The price difference alone would discourage many people from buying electric car. If a government wants to promote them, it has to at least narrow the gap, which can be done either through direct subsidy of the EV or taxing the hell out of the ICE vehicle. Norway decided to go with the taxation. It imposes a one-time vehicle registration tax, which is based on three factors: CO2 emissions, nitrous oxides emissions, and weight. Expensive cars tend to be both heavier and more powerful and therefore also more polluting, so they are taxed progressively more. The registration tax is usually a large proportion of the purchase price and sometimes costs even more than the car itself. In our example, let's assume that the registration tax is 50% of the purchase price itself, which is quite a conservative assumption. EVs are exempt from the registration tax, except for a much smaller tax based on weight, which might be around $2,000. The registration tax itself can make the EV cheaper than the regular car. On top of that, there is a 25% value-added tax on most consumer goods in Norway, including gasoline and diesel cars. Of course, electric cars are again exempt from this tax. The results are staggering. Just like that, the government has warped the market and turned EV's biggest disadvantage to their benefit. It didn't stop with the purchase price. There are many incentives to the advantage of EVs when it comes to usage. The most obvious one is the price of fuel itself. The main economic argument of EV proponents is that the electricity is cheaper than the fuel for the same mileage, which may or may not be true depending on fuel and electricity prices in the specific country. Norway is lucky to be endowed with an incredible number of high-altitude lakes, which supplies it with cheap renewable energy. Therefore, its electricity prices are one of the cheapest in Europe, giving a natural advantage to EVs. However, taxation plays a significant role again. When it comes to gasoline or diesel, on top of the price of the fuel itself, you have to pay an excise tax, which is a fixed number of Norwegian crowns per liter. You also have a CO2 tax, which corresponds to the carbon footprint of the fuel. Then you have to pay the 25% VAT again. Incredibly, the VAT is calculated from the price including the excise tax and the CO2 tax. So you basically pay taxes from taxes. Isn't it wonderful? The total share of taxes on the final price of gasoline depends on current oil prices, but generally they make up around half of the total price or even slightly more. While the precise numbers may vary, the fact that taxes constitute a large share of fuel prices is true across Europe. To be fair, electricity in Norway is also subject to the 25% VAT and excise tax, however, no CO2 tax. The total share of taxes on final prices again varies based on the electricity price, but generally seems to be around a third. So the tax burden on fossil fuels is somewhat higher than for electricity in percentage terms. But it is even higher in absolute numbers, since electricity required for 1 kilometer drive is cheaper than gasoline necessary for the same distance. There are, however, more explicit government incentives for EVs usage. Electric vehicles in Norway were exempt from paying the tolls on toll roads and could use the ferries for free. This was rolled back to 50% discount in 2018. EVs also enjoyed free municipal parking up to that year. It is impossible to calculate the value of those benefits because it is highly individual. But I think an estimate on the order of hundreds of dollars per year combined is reasonable. And until few years back, EVs were also exempt from annual traffic insurance tax, again amounting to a couple $100. I have to ask you for a favor. I put a lot of effort into these videos. If you feel that I deserve it, please consider subscribing to this channel and hit the like button. Finally, there are things that the government can do to boost the pure convenience of using EVs. One popular advantage in Norway is that electric cars can drive in the bus lanes, thus saving time in heavy traffic.
Oh, you see this guy? See this guy? Number one bullshit guy.
Obviously, a major issue of convenience is the availability of charging stations. Here, the government also intervened by co-financing or subsidizing the charging points. I cannot help but mention the irony of the wealth and public spending being partially enabled by huge oil and gas exports. While having a population of only 5.5 million, Norway is one of the largest exporters of both commodities. In per capita terms, it exports more of those commodities than any other country in the world except for Qatar, more than Saudi Arabia. The proceeds are heavily taxed and are funneled back into public spending. What about the other European countries? While Norway is an extreme example, many other states adopted some form of EV incentives. First, let's look at the purchase price again. Unlike Norway, which taxed the hell out of combustion engine cars, several European countries used carrot rather than the stick and offered direct subsidies for new EVs. Germany offered almost 7,000 euros in subsidy for the purchase before stopping in December 23, more on that later. France offers a subsidy of 4,000 euros, even though it newly restricted it for cars built in the EU. Hungary offers a huge discount for businesses, amounting to between 7,500 and 10,500 euros, depending on the battery capacity. Estonia supports individuals with 5,000 euros per car and businesses with 4,000. Britain had a government grant from which you were able to get £3,500 until 2020. However, the program was phased out and stopped completely in 2022. Italy supported the purchase of EVs with up to 6,000 euros, part of the bonus being linked to scrappage of an old combustion engine car. The subsidy has been recently increased up to walloping 13,500 euros for low-income citizens if they also scrap their car that is pre-Euro 3. Spain has also high direct subsidies, 7,000 for electric cars and 9,000 for electric vans, if applicants scrap their old vehicles. Apart from Norway, some countries chose heavy taxation of fossil fuel cars instead. The most striking example is Denmark, which has likely the highest vehicle registration tax in the world. It is based on the market price of the vehicle and its CO2 emissions, and the tax rate rises progressively with both price and emissions. Even for cheaper cars, the tax may be as high as the price of the vehicle itself. Expensive cars with high emissions may see their price be almost tripled. Sweden utilizes an annual tax instead of one-time registration tax, but the amounts are still staggering. Comment below whether you think this is reasonable or have the Scandinavian governments gone crazy. Sweden also had a 4,500 euro direct subsidy until 2022. Ireland still combines the carrot and the stick. It has high registration tax from which EVs are mostly exempt, and a direct subsidy of 3,500 euros. Moving on to the benefits of usage, a very common incentive is free parking in otherwise paid zones in large cities. Among those cities are Paris, Berlin, Prague, Budapest and certain boroughs of London. Helsinki and Bratislava offer 50% discount. In many large cities, you also need to pay a so-called congestion charge if you want to enter the city or its center during the weekdays. Other cities have instead low emission zones where the entrance of combustion engine cars is either forbidden or allowed only after paying a fee. EVs are often exempt from both of these charges as yet another benefit. Among cities that charge one or the other are Rome, Madrid, Amsterdam, Barcelona or Stockholm. There are also cities that charge both, like Milano or London.
What it does mean is that there are those of us who have cars in town which will now have to pay not only the congestion charge, but the ULEZ fee. The congestion charge is £15 a day, and the ULEZ charge is £12.50. So that's £27.50 a day.
Many countries offer other benefits, such as exemptions or discounts on annual road taxes or tolls. There are too many benefits to list them all in all European countries in one video, but as you can see, the support is widespread and often massive. But what happens if you take those subsidies away? The German government abruptly ended the EV purchase subsidies in mid-December 2023, and the EV sales reacted immediately. In January, they were down 55% compared to December, which was also weaker than expected. To be fair, January tends to be a weak month. Still, the first quarter of 2024 saw a 14% decline compared to the first quarter of 2023. At the same time, combustion engine car sales grew by 4.2% in the same period. The market share of EVs declined to 11.7%, down from around 18% the previous year. Remember, there are still other incentives in Germany in favor of EVs. We see a broader pattern here. Countries with largest EV subsidies and combustion engine car bullying generally have the highest sales of electric cars. Another important factor is at play. The states with highest EV sales also tend to be very high income, confirming that the price difference is still a large obstacle. In the states with both low EV subsidies and much lower income than the Scandinavians, the sales dwindle. An example can be Czech Republic, where EVs account for only 3% of new car sales. Recently, many states had to revise their EV share targets. So while the rollback of subsidies is unlikely to stop the spread of EVs completely, it can slow it down significantly. So what is the future of EV subsidies? As you could see, electric vehicles enjoy a lot of political benefits. However, it is crystal clear that this will not last. Many states face growing budget deficits and are scaling back the subsidies because they simply cannot afford them. But even if they could, it has been quite explicitly stated that the goal is to make EVs more attractive relative to fossil fuel cars. If they become the new normal and establish a dominant position, the subsidies will be rolled back and eventually stopped completely. We can already see this in Norway. The politicians hope that with technological progress and infrastructure buildup, the EVs will be the clear choice on their own merit. The dwindling sales in the absence of large-scale government incentives are proof that we are still far from there. And it will not end with EVs. The greenheads consider electric cars only a lesser evil. The manufacturing of an electric car is environmentally more unfriendly than of a gasoline car. The next push is going to be against all cars in favor of public transport. The final step is to reduce transport altogether, as reflected in concepts like the 15-minute cities. So you EV enthusiasts should also be skeptical about the bullying practices currently aimed at combustion engine cars, because you're next.